So it came out in the news on RT that Swedes deploy underwater gay sailor to fend off Russian subs. And so, looking into this more, it brought me into Russia's anti-gay laws. Looking up the religious demographics of Russia, it's 41% Russian Orthodox, 4% unaffiliated Orthodox, and then there's a pretty large, a 13% atheist and non-religious crowd, and a very large spiritual but non-religious crowd, 25%. And this is supposedly in 2012. The United States of America, I found about on Wikipedia 2008, 76% of the American population identified themselves as Christian, which is close to the 83% the ABC poll that I cite in a lot of my videos. So let me just play a clip from Russia's anti-gay law from The Economist channel.
Gay and lesbian activists, some calling for a boycott, others calling on the national governments to speak out more strongly in opposition to this law. And all of that, this kind of groundswell of international grassroots reaction, I think is something that really came out of a blind spot for Russian officials.
Because the aim of this law was domestic, wasn't it? It's part of the kind of creating a new national myth, appealing to the conservative and perhaps provincial base of support that the regime has, where homosexuals, sexual minorities are vilified along with political oppositionists and foreigners and liberals and other exotic and supposedly deviant and un-Russian categories of people.
That's right. That's exactly what this is. It's of a piece with other legislation we've seen in the last year. Everything from criminalizing so-called the offense of believers, essentially criminalizing blasphemy, to banning the adoption of Russian children by Americans. All of these laws are meant to purposefully antagonize Western-leaning, more modernized segments of society and throw a bit of political red meat to this conservative majority.
So it's funny how they want to spread democracy, but they don't want to accept its results when it goes against the gay agenda, when it goes against the pedophile agenda. They explore further about how they're trying to link pedophilia and homosexuality, which it is linked. I've proven that many times in my videos. There's a disproportionate amount of pedophiles who are homosexuals. And then they go on to talk about immigration, trying to link racial issues with the persecution of homosexuals. So they want it to be okay to offend the religious majority. It sort of reminds me of the Muslim cartoon drawing that we had in the news recently in Texas, where 2 Muslims were killed trying to stop the blasphemy from happening. Certain countries understand that it's not right to use your freedom of speech to insult people's religions. There's a certain limit on freedoms of speech. You can't have hate speech against people, unfairly. Just saying racist things for no reason. But you can express disgust at certain groups of people who, for example, homosexuals who go against religion. That's fair. That's part of politics, So it's very interesting how, something that has never been proven to be genetic, and even if it was, it doesn't mean you can't express disdain for it. That's ridiculous. It's very interesting how that Russia takes a stand against this, and you have gay people saying that, oh, this is unfair, it's going against, people with Western views, etc., etc. If you live in a democracy and you're putting things up to a vote, and they also did a poll where they said about 76% of people approve of the anti-gay laws. So you're in a democracy and the majority of people disagree with homosexuality being pushed upon people, propaganda, demanding more rights, then you should respect that decision. That's part of democratic values, is putting things up to a vote and the majority rules, so to speak. What I see time and time again is you have people saying, that they don't want to have oppressed minorities, okay? an oppressed minority view. But they turn around and say that they want democracy. Democracy means that there's going to be people, small groups of people who don't get their way and they don't like it. That's part of democracy. You know, all these people don't really know what they're talking about. All these homosexuals, they're a very small percentage of places. You know, they're 1 to 2% in America. They're probably 1 to 2% in Russia. And yet they want to go against the overwhelming Orthodox Christian and religious majority of the country. Makes absolutely no sense. You know, just because you don't like a country's decision doesn't mean that they should change that decision. Doesn't mean that we should go to war with them. Doesn't mean that we should manipulate and blackmail and bribe people till you get your way. You know, accept their decision. If you don't like the laws in that country, you know, you can try to change them or you can leave. And if it's not that serious, then you certainly shouldn't go to war over it or shouldn't try to use secret society manipulation. So I commend Russia's anti-gay laws. You know, it's absolutely in line with their religious beliefs. And the number one argument you're going to see from people who disagree with my argument is they're saying that, and I get this time and time again, which is an invalid argument, they're saying that, the Bible, for example, is used to justify slavery. The Bible doesn't say what race is slaves. You understand me? And it does understand the times. It's talking about how you should treat your slaves because that was a time when slavery was prevalent. Nowadays, we live in a different time where slavery is considered heinous and immoral. So you really have no point there. Okay, we all know that slavery was wrong. You know, was it in the Bible's best interest to speak out against something that perhaps was part of God's greater plan for society? You know, the Bible doesn't say that you have to have slaves, that slavery has to be part of society, that it's part of what God expects from society. There is instances in the Old Testament where they say take slaves and etc., because that was part of what was considered fair in war. That was part of how nations fought with each other. It's part of how God punished groups of people. So it's very sad that people try to equate these things. They're not equatable. They're not the same. Race and homosexuality are not the same. They're not even similar. The only way that they're similar at all is saying that people are different. Again, pedophiles are different. Serial killers are different. Murderers are different. You know, so how are we going to, you know, when a society has decided this is a sin, how are you going to say that, you know, you're wrong and that we're going to force you to see it our way? How are you going to complain about that? You know, this is what majority of society sees as a sin. You're not going to change their religion by waving gay flags and being obnoxious. You know, nowhere in the Bible does it say being black is a sin. In fact, black people own some of the slaves. Egyptians were black people who owned slaves, for example. The black people who sold the slaves to America obviously were black. So I don't see how you're going to equate any of these things with race.